Hello and welcome to another episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. I'm your host Scott, and here with me is my host Caleb. Caleb, how are you?
Yeah, doing good. Another cold day here in Minnesota.
That's right, it's January. Today we're back again to talk about the experience growing up as youth group kids in the 90s and how that has shaped our adult lives. We'll talk to some old friends about their faith journeys spanning from the 90s to today and discuss current cultural topics through the lens of someone who grew up during that era. So, Caleb, it's just you and I today. What are we going to talk about?
Yeah, I threw out some topics, you threw out some topics, and I think you wanted to kind of get into some of this idea of, maybe things that we were taught to be afraid of or taught to worry about, or I'm trying to think of other ways to say it.
Ultimate concerns, a little bit cultural, a little bit spiritual, that sort of thing. Really kind of, if you listen to our intro episode, which I hope you all did. If not, go back. It's in the archives.
Don't just listen to it once. Listen to it twice.
Yeah, we need those listens.
Yeah. Hi, this is Caleb, the producer of the show, just breaking in like I do every episode to remind everyone that the views and opinions expressed on this show may not actually be held or even approved of by everyone appearing on this episode. One of the goals of this show is to give everyone a safe space to share their opinions and thoughts on deeply personal matters of faith. We are not looking to start an argument, but instead let people share how they feel. We also know that our memories of events that happened 25 to 30 years ago may not be 100% accurate. We assume everyone's best intentions as they share how they remembered the experience of their youth. Now, back to the show.
We talked about, there was this implication or this idea that, rightful or not, that maybe a Lutheran, maybe a Catholic, maybe they weren't actually a Christian because they didn't quote unquote cross that line of faith. And so then I think that got us thinking about how we were prescribed that equation for faith. So what it looked like for us, and our church used that phrase, cross the line of faith. That's what they did.
So now I don't remember that phrase until we got a lead pastor. So
I think it was more of a Henry thing. Henry
Yeah.
was our lead pastor. He came like late 90s.
Yeah. Okay.
And he gave that to us. But our youth pastor, John, ostensibly he was saying the same thing.
Yeah, totally.
So, and that was something that, now looking back on, it's like, well, the analogy may have been a little too simple.
Well, yeah, that idea, I always think about, this is a whole other topic. I always think about that idea of like, we re-engineer words and we come up with new definitions that we think are better. And are they really better than the definitions people were using, 400 years ago? I don't know if they were, maybe some of them are, maybe some of them aren't, but yeah, cross the line of faith. I don't see Luther having, he nailed that up on the wall and then make sure you cross the line of faith. Probably wasn't something he said.
And certainly by that definition, there are many, many, many people, millions and billions of people who very well have been well-intentioned and were following God in their own way that, didn't say those words or make that conscious decision in their mind. And I don't know, by that definition, are they, if you want to say that if they're in heaven or hell, who knows?
They never had the opportunity to go to a Jeff Moore in the Distance concert. So how would they know what words to say?
How are we supposed to get this message to them in the past? So what were some analogies that we were taught about, like that were used for something like that?
Yeah. So, one that sticks out to me, and this kind of goes with a bit of the idea of what were you afraid or taught to be afraid of or worried about. But I remember a distinct teaching that idea of cross the line of faith or become a Christian, and how it had to be yours and it couldn't be your parents, right? It needed to be you. You needed to take it, which I think is well-intentioned. Let's be real clear. I think that idea of trying to get somebody to own their faith is not a bad concept at all. But the teaching that came through, and it still sticks with me all these years later, is the idea that I remember John saying, just because you're in a garage doesn't mean you're a car. And I was always, that stuck with me. So, and I think the intention behind it was, that just because you go to church doesn't mean you're a Christian, and you've got to actually own it And so yeah, but that I remember that, and I think the other one was just because you're at McDonald's doesn't make you a Big Mac or doesn't make you a burger. I think that was the other one he said, which resonated with me as I worked at McDonald's
You did, that's right.
for years and years and years. Yeah,
Well, yeah, that's I mean, obviously he was simplifying things for us, right? To make it your own. And to be honest, I'm not adverse to something like that, but it makes you kind of, it silos you into this kind of single way of saying like, oh, you're not a Christian unless you do this.
yeah,
And I'm not saying that everybody's a Christian or no, but it's like you got to be a little bit careful with those definitions. I've known plenty of people who are God followers who just don't ever think that way.
yeah,
And I think at the end of the day, everyone that we went to youth group with would say yes, it's their heart that matters. It's where they are positioned that matters, with their belief in Jesus and God and Christ and incarnation, resurrection. But that it ends up turning into a bit of a moral thing
yeah,
because the implication is you don't you if you just because you go to church doesn't mean you're Christian. So how do we know?
mm-hmm.
How we know because you do XYZ.
Yeah,
We also know because you don't do ABC. So you not only do you go to church, but you read your Bible every day, you pray every day, but you also don't swear. You definitely don't drink, and all this stuff. And it's like it's marked. Your relationship with God is not only marked by by that decision to follow God, but the decision to follow God is marked by a moral indicator.
totally. Yeah, and I can really see that. Like it makes this idea that like, okay, just because you're not just because you're in a garage doesn't make you a car, but you need to be a car and you need to do these things. Like this is how we know. And I think at the time, I mean, just to be frank, I was totally okay with that, right? Like even to like
Same.
16-year-old me, it actually simplified it to a point where it was like, oh, this is good, right? I just have this list of things I can do, and if I follow those, I'm good. I'm good.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Mm-hmm. It's like I said again. I'm not saying that you moral decisions aren't important. In fact, obviously, the idea is that should you choose to become a Christian, some of those things might become convictions. But as a teenager, at least the way it was described back then, gave us the real temptation to judge whether someone was or was not in or outside of the circle.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's at the end of the day, it's like, man, who am I to judge? Somebody could be going through something. Again, we were just kids. We're going through a lot of stuff anyway. So cut us some slack,
Right.
It was hard for me to untie the morality indicators with the actual decision to follow Christ.
It really also it made it when that movie Cars came out, it really impacted my viewing experience of that movie. I'll never look at Owen Wilson the same way. That's for sure.
I'm pretty sure based on what I perceive of him that he's not a Christian.
No, I definitely not even in the garage. He's not even in the garage.
He's way out there.
Come on the show. Come on the show, Owen.
Let's pause a minute and pray for Owen Wilson.
I just pray he keeps on doing Wes Anderson movies. That's
There
my
you go.
prayer.
I'm not going to comment because I'm sure they're good. I just don't see a lot of movies. Sorry. Don't get angry.
Go watch your Succession.
Sorry. So one of the things that I remember being afraid of was culture. And, people, culture that are like outside, again, your Christian circle, because there was this fear that it was just going to drag you down. And that's still a message that we see today.
Oh, for sure.
For sure. And yeah, not all of culture is good, but not all of culture is bad. And there was a real like inability to figure out how to interact with culture in a way that was actually relationship building instead of just goal oriented. The goal being, hey, I'm going to get to know you because I want you to come to youth group and because I want you to accept Jesus. And I think even back then, I think kids are smart enough to see right through that.
Yeah.
maybe if it's more simplistic than that, at the very least, like, do you actually care about them as a person? And particularly today, people our age can certainly see right through that. And I think that was, I remember that being very much a big red flag. Like, culture is going to get you, it's going to drag you down. It's going to change the way that you live. It's going to change the way your kids live. And if we let it get out of control, we're going to enter this period of postmodernism. So right now in the 90s, whatever culture, ability to affect culture we have left, we need to be the culture police.
Hmm.
And we need to give clear standard and direction to the culture so it doesn't fall away from God. And so that idea of postmodernism really stuck with me. And as I went to college and into seminary, started to study it more and more and just kind of watched for it. And essentially the idea being, hey, once we enter a most postmodern age, forget about any standard moral ground. Everybody gets to choose for themselves what's right and what's wrong. Everybody's going to be able to choose for themselves what's truth and what's not truth. And now in 2024, we have Christians who are very willing to believe lies, who are
Hmm.
very willing to engage in lies for their own cultural benefit.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking politically, of course, at the moment, but there's multiple examples. The big one that I can think of right now is just 2020 election. Is it stolen or not? Like, that's kind of my one big ask. It's like, do
Right.
you believe it was stolen or not? And if someone says, yes, I think it was stolen, I'm like, you're choosing to believe what's truth and what's not. Look, I'm not here to tell you to vote for whoever this year. I'm just saying, if you believe that, that's a lie.
Right.
And you're choosing for your own benefit to believe that it could be true. And that's the definition of postmodern.
So I totally went through that, but for me it was college. I will be honest. That was not something I remember from high school, but I remember, and so this is still semi related to the 90s. I was in college in the 90s briefly. Not that I dropped out of college. I just was older. And so like I remember going to conferences because I did Campus Crusade in college, and we would go to like the winter conference over the holiday break, and yeah, I remember there was like breakout sessions on postmodernism, and we were reading books on apologetics because we had to be able to argue against that sort of thing, and it was it was exactly that is, oh, it's just going to turn into, dude, you can believe whatever you want to believe, and how do we actually engage with people if they're just believing whatever they want to believe? And what I think is interesting, this isn't really related to fearing it or being taught against it, but I think the culture swung back the other way in general. Like, I think there are very few people who would go out and just say, like, the argument was always like, oh, it's just going to turn into somebody wants to believe this orange is their god. You're never going to be able to argue against them. And I think that's been totally rejected. I think there's been a strong pushback to like, no, I see scientific evidence for my lack of faith, or I see my scientific evidence that leads me to believe in, this point of view. And I just think it's swung totally back the other way, which is just a whole interesting commentary about where that argument has gone and that whole conversation has gone. So yeah.
I forgot about the apologetics industry.
Industry, great word.
Shout out Lee Strobel. It was definitely a period piece of evangelicalism in the late 90s. Was like, oh no,
Yeah.
we have to prove this. And then you had like Lee Strobel versus Da Vinci Code for a little bit and all this kind of stuff.
The Case for Christ is the one I remember. I remember reading that one, and
Did like 3 or 4
at least. Yeah.
Case for Faith too. And look, they're compelling books. I get it. I get why we'd want to do that. But at some point, that reaction to postmodernism and the reaction to fluctuating morality became lack of faith. It
Yeah.
became certainty. You had to be certain of this.
Mm.
Otherwise, not only did you have to be certain of it, you had to be able to sell it to somebody and make them certain of it for them to believe. And at the end of the day, it's just that's not it.
Yeah.
It's a heart it's a heart movement piece. It's about, choosing to believe something bigger than yourself. And it just became the opposite of faith for me in that regard. It's just, hey, I got to be sure of this. Well, what happens when 200 years from now, 100 years from now, 10 years from now, something comes along that's factually true? And that, is it faith anymore, or is it just believing a set of facts?
Right. Yeah. And that's totally what it has become. And I think that led into the early 2000s. One of the questions that I threw out there for our guests is the idea of phases of faith. And I'm stealing from Tim Keller. And like one of my phases for sure was the idea of like restless reform. That's what I call that those of us who got really into reform theology. I was going to Bethlehem Baptist and really was into just those sorts of things. And I wonder how much of that just pushed right into it. The apologetics got less focused on persuading people that Jesus was real and instead got into like, let's dive into theological arguments. And I was really excited by that stuff. And really, I mean, it was good for me in the sense that it pushed me intellectually, but it did, when you can arc out everything and prove it all, there is a lack of faith, in my opinion. I think that's a great explanation of it.
It was almost as if, too, like, hey, we have to put out this set of theological beliefs or proofs, let's say, empirical proofs, so that people don't leave the
Yeah.
faith. They're
Oh,
gonna
totally.
they're gonna go into this culture that's filled with science, and they're going to be dissuaded because science is going to take them away. Another topic there, things you should fear, is like that sense of like, hey, what's out there is what's factually true can sometimes contradict the Bible. So how often do we allow one to interpret the other? So, for example, for me, there was a phase for thinking that Genesis was actual 24-hour days, 6 days. Therefore, the Earth is 6,000 years old or whatever. Look, if you believe that, that's okay. I'm not going to judge you for it. I understand why you would. But also, it's facts. Like, it's not. And then not only that, once you start learning about the historical background of Genesis and the way it drew from very, very eerily, hauntingly similar origin stories that were written at the same time, you realize, okay, we're describing something in that time frame that I still believe to be true. It just doesn't mean it has to be exactly true. And we can get, I'm not even going to get into inerrancy tonight, because that would be hours and hours. But, the word day in Genesis, John MacArthur had to make sure you knew that the interpretation of that Hebrew word is 24-hour period.
Right.
Because it hinged on everything for that word to be 24 hours.
Yeah.
And it's simply not true. Plus the fact that the words itself, not the letter, excuse me, the book itself, at least that section of the book, is poetry. It's not a scientific document. And so starting to reconcile those two and coming to a point of like, hey, I can believe something a little bit different and it's fine, was very freeing. Like that was kind of one of the first steps for me to be like, maybe things aren't the way that I was taught.
Right. Yeah. And I'm very much like in the camp, like you said, like I'm there at this point. Like I don't have strong opinions about Genesis 1, but like I'm very much like, I'll say my wife is totally oh yeah, I think it was just 7 days, and I'm like, that's great. I'm glad you believe that, honey. It's whatever, the way you live out your faith is way more important to me than whether you believe that was 6 or 7 days. But then you're right, it does become about that, like everything hinges on it. So that's the only thing I've pushed her to is like, hey, if your entire faith breaks down because that's not a 6-day period of time that happened 6,000 years ago, just take a step back and just examine your faith as a whole and make sure that that is not this thing that if that breaks down at some point, then because there's a whole bunch of things that I think can break that down. I don't want you to lose your faith because all of a sudden that becomes a stumbling block for you. So I think that's for me is like just that pushback of like, believe it, that's great. Don't believe it, that's great. I have opinions. I can go either way on any given day. Well, probably less so now, but that idea that yeah, it became so important that that is true. Otherwise, the rest of your theology just crumbles. Just crumbles.
That's a great point that you make because it's like we weren't taught how to have a faith that kind of matures and evolves over time.
Mm.
And in one sense, I kind of get it. We were only there for a few years, as we talked
Yeah.
about with our friend Bill. He was only there for 2 years. I mean, you were there. You were in that youth group for like 6, but still, it's not like we're living with these people. They're doing their
Yeah.
best in this short amount of time. I get it. But part of going down that road of certainty and apologetics is we're not teaching you how to have a faith that might change over time and still adhere to a belief in Christ. It is if one of these things which we would adopt as quote unquote pillars gets rocked, the whole thing falls apart. And
Yeah. Yep.
there's lots of people who had to go through that because they were taught like if we can't trust what Genesis 1 says, never mind that it's totally different than Genesis 2 in terms of time frame, but that's another episode. If we're not absolutely certain, or if it's not absolutely true what that says, how can we believe the rest of what the Bible says?
Right. Yeah.
And that can be hard for some people. And I get why that was because that's what we were taught. But we weren't taught how to kind of let that go and keep moving forward with our faith.
Yeah. And how much of the industry played a part in that, right? Like you gotta sell books. I mean, industry is a great word. I really, really, really can see that. Like, oh yeah, let's put out apologetics books because they sell good and they probably bring people back for more. I mean, so yeah, that's a great word for it.
This is a side note or a little bit of a tangent, but how many different versions of the Bible did you have? I'm not talking about translations. I'm talking about like teen Bible and study Bible. And because I worked in the bookstore, I worked in that Christian bookstore, and I swear, dude, there was like 30 different types of Bibles.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And I get it. I get it. That's not the same thing doesn't work for everybody, but that's pretty overkill. So how many did you have? I think I had like 4. I had teen, I had study, and I probably had a men's.
You just progressed.
Yeah, right.
You're in puberty. Here's your Bible. You're now almost out of puberty. Here's your Bible. You're out of puberty. Here's your Bible.
Well,
Hand me my puberty Bible. I don't think I have. I never had a teen one. I feel pretty confident of that. I think in college I probably got I had one, and then I probably got a study Bible, and then I switched again that whole restless reform thing, where I probably then had an NASB, and then I got an ESV.
old school.
So yeah, I mean, so that's probably where mine came in, and then I think we have a MacArthur somewhere in here, somewhere in this house. I know at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I definitely had a couple of them, and then I had one that had like Hebrew and Greek in it, probably in the footnotes, like more of it. Not that I could do anything with that because I didn't learn any of that.
I'm sure our listeners or listener, wherever we're either at one or more than one, out there can maybe throw it up on Twitter. How many versions of the Bible did you have? And I don't want translations. I want like because, dude, I know now there's like the Patriot Bible
Oh yeah, I bet you there is.
and like the Grandparents Bible and all this stuff, and it's about selling the product. It's all
Yeah,
that
totally.
at the end of the day, it's about selling the stuff. It's a grift. I mean, again, this is a tangent, but like you talk about Jesus being pissed, that's what he was
Yeah,
pissed about was the grift. And like, I'm okay with like having a couple of different kinds or whatever. I think all of mine are gone somewhere, but I do see on my shelf a life application. That's what I was thinking. Life
life
application
application.
Bible. Yep, I see that over there. Anyway, yes, that was part of the industry to be sure.
Yeah.
It fed into having that apologetics piece was a really big spot. Again, I used to work in a Christian bookstore. We had a whole section dedicated to it, and
Oh yeah.
it exploded
Yeah.
in late '90s, early 2000s.
Totally. Okay, so another industry then that leads into one of the other things that I thought about was the Left Behind books and the end times. Like that was a whole thing too that we were totally, and like Dawson McAllister conference, I don't know, I think he's still doing radio, but 2 years in a row, and I remember it, they did end times talks, and like that was a big thing, and I remember being so excited to learn how the world was going to end.
I remember plenty of end times. I don't remember it being spoken about Dawson McAllister.
Really?
No, I mean I don't. We've talked about our memory being poor, but I'm sure it was. Like I have no doubt that it was.
Oh man, those are so vivid to me. Do you remember Dawson McAllister? We'd like line up early and run in there and try and tape off sections. So you remember that?
Yep,
Wow, but don't remember that.
at the Target Center.
Yeah. Oh man, that's crazy. I remember. I distinctly remember End Times 2 years in a row, and it was such a big hit, which is even more ridiculous. It was such a big hit the first year that they
Yep.
did it a second year.
Oh yes, now I remember that. Um, I don't think he's doing radio anymore because unfortunately he passed in 2020.
Oh, so sorry.
Yeah, it looks like he was doing a bunch of radio up until he passed. But
Okay.
no, I don't. I don't. I do remember that it was like a sequel. It was
Yeah.
like, all right, this has legs. Let's run with it.
And I have some personal stories from that from the second conference. I'm not going to get into because they involve somebody who I'm sure will never listen to this, but I'm not going to get into it.
Fair
It
enough.
was very awkward. I'll tell you off air.
Well, I did want to ask, did you actually read the Left Behind books?
I did not. I've never watched any of the movies, and I avoided that one. I avoided that one. I'm proud to say.
It got to the point where it in and of itself was so popular in the Christian circles that it got to be too popular for us, and we became super cynical about it.
Oh yeah,
But I will admit that I did read some of them.
we'll do episodes on each of them. But you recap book one. Yeah, real exciting stuff.
God, if we had sponsored, we'd lose them at that point. I do remember I stopped because I realized at a certain point that the writing was just pure garbage. So like, I don't know, it was like book 4 or 5 or whatever, and one of the characters was on the plane, flying a plane, and the Archangel Michael was like his radio control guy. And so instead of saying Roger that, he said like Michael that or something. And then the guy next to him was like, "Why'd you say Michael?" He's like, "Well, I got Michael guiding me, not, but." And it was so bad. It was like in the middle of the book. I closed the book, I threw it across the room, and I never picked up the series again because it was like, it's pure garbage. And you realize like, oh yeah, it actually wasn't good writing. They were just trying to sell this story of like, hey, we could be in the end times.
Oh man, I totally missed it. I don't know why. I have no idea why it didn't captivate. Those books didn't captivate me, but yeah, I totally missed it. But I do remember that idea that like you need to be worried about this. You need to be ready. You need to be ready. And there's that old Larry Norman song that then DC Talk redid. I wish we'd all been ready. That like even that like it's a good song, but like yeah, it has a bit of menace to it. And I think that's the Rapture specifically. There's a bit of menace to it. And I don't know if I even have a theological belief on the end times at this point outside of it's probably going to happen and I'm probably going to suck at it. That's probably Caleb will not end times well.
There's it's now a verb. There's half a chance that Caleb will be left behind.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I remember going into college with it, and it was like sophomore year. We had sounds like you had Campus Crusade. We had University.
Yeah.
And I was part of University on my college campus, and we had like this weekend retreat at a church in town. I don't even know what we did. We just sang worship songs and talked about groups we're gonna do whatever. And we like 2 nights in a row, we like stayed up super late talking about, are you pre-trib? Are you post-trib? Are you
Oh
blah blah
man.
blah? And I'm just like, and then I'll never forget the day that the when we started talking about Revelation in seminary, the professor was like, "Hey, just so you know, here's all the ways that it can be interpreted," and he opened up this like humongous map, and it was just like all these different. It was like one of those conspiracy like red string things where someone's got it up on his wall.
Yeah, the famous one from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it made me realize, and even what my professor said at Bethel, they said that,
Shh, you're gonna get him fired. Everyone's
I
listening.
think he probably was.
Oh,
At the end of the day, it's like, again, if you had $1 for every Christian who thought the end times was going to happen in your life, you would be a billionaire.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Because everybody thinks it's going to happen.
Yeah. There's another industry in predicting, predicting when it's going to happen. And, but I remember that, like, that idea of menace with it, it felt like a scare tactic. So there's some things that I can kind of look back on and go, okay, the intent was, the cheeseburger one or the car in the garage one, like the intent there was, I think, a good intent. I question some of the intent behind the end time stuff.
I think a lot of the intent was probably, hey, we got to take this literal. Because remember,
Mm.
we're
Oh
literalists,
yeah, yeah.
we're inerrant. So we got to take this literal. So we have to figure out what the seals mean. And we
Mm.
have to figure out who the four horsemen are and all this kind of stuff. And we have to figure out the timing. And that's kind of where that inerrancy, and again, we're not going to talk about that tonight, but that's where
No,
some
we've
of that
got episodes lined up. Well, you'll just go through an errancy and it'll just be great bedtime stuff. You want to, put it
be great
on.
bedtime stuff because people won't get 2 minutes through it. They'll be like,
Right,
"This is
exactly.
terrible." But it was trying to be truthful to that interpretation of scripture, where again, the style of that writing is not meant to be a dictated timeline. It's meant to be poetic, and it's meant to
Yeah.
be. It's not. It's just that's not what it was intended to do.
Yeah.
To your point, that fear sells, right? Hey,
Yeah.
do you know where you're gonna go if you were to die tonight? I'm like, ooh,
Yeah.
I think that's in some circumstances a legitimate question, but like, hey, going back to inviting kids to youth group, like many times they'd be invited to youth group, and that's the first thing that they would hear.
Right. Yeah.
Ugh, I don't know, but and I don't think I'm misrepresenting here by any means, but I do distinctly remember our youth pastor saying he believed the rapture would happen in his lifetime,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is also basically my lifetime.
Right. Yeah. Well, hopefully. You got 30 years on you, or 20 years on you. So, yeah. That's interesting to hear, like, the idea of his in his lifetime and in your lifetime. And I can see that too, because one of the things I remember from the Dawson McAllister conferences, I'm not meaning to harp on him, but he would do literal interpretations. That was part of the conference. Was he would read a passage and then he would say things like, "No, I'm not 100%." He would always kind of give that little preference, that little exception or whatever you call it. But then he would say, like,
Call that a liability disclaimer.
disclaimer. That's the word. Yes, he'd give that disclaimer, but then he would say things like, I remember him saying, "No, these are clearly tanks," or "These are clearly these sorts of things." Like he would read a passage.
Like army tanks.
Yeah, yeah, not like "Thank you for coming to my restaurant," but like tanks. And he would get that specific with, "This clearly means this," and this is, I'm not 100% sure, but I am 100% sure it's talking about Turkey. And like, he would get like really specific with those sorts of things, which can again just kind of drive home that idea that, well, if we're talking about modern tanks, it's definitely going to happen in my lifetime.
Yikes. Like, well, why? And being an impressionable teen, you're in a atmosphere where all the emotion is swirling and stuff. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, you're not trained to think critically about that.
Yeah.
It's just like, yep, this is the interpretation. This is how it's always been. So of course, when the fourth century Christians were reading it, they were also thinking about tanks. But it's it's just like, oh yeah, no, well, you got to be ready, and now it's your job to go out and make sure everybody else is ready. But the reality is, nobody cares what you think about their eternal salvation until you care about them themselves, that person
Hmm.
themselves, and that we were just it was just that which just wasn't part of that message.
Yeah, totally. One of my other rogue theories is that sort of end times thing has led to. So I'm gonna use a semi-offensive phrase. Be ready. Maybe we'll have to have my son come down and beep it out. He likes to beep me when I curse. So I see in a lot of evangelical culture today that there's a lot of evangelicals who are horny for the apocalypse. That's how I would describe it. As like they want it bad. And
Today, it's been
yeah.
like 30 years of it.
But I didn't get it back then. I probably was horny for the apocalypse at one point. Oh, this just got real awkward. But like it does seem to be a prevailing thought of like, yes, we're ready. We're ready for God to come back, and it's going to be so good to see him slaughter those infidels. I am so excited for
Hmm.
them to just get what's coming to them.
Hmm. I remember hearing a reasonable interpretation of some of what happens in Revelation, which is to say that we can't have any idea of what's going to happen. But if you take maybe a higher, 10,000 foot view of it, you will see the juxtaposition of the lion and the lamb.
Hmm.
Whereas Christ is the lamb, he is the peacemaker, he is the one
Hmm.
who has come to lay himself down, even in that situation. And you get, yeah, I mean, you're talking about people who probably love Mark Driscoll or something like that because, it's anger, it's Old
Hmm.
Testament anger coming through. And I think a lot of that just stems from mostly this idea that Jesus did so much for us that we have to honor. In order to honor that, I don't want anything to offend that or water that down. So we have to again defend culture and all this kind of stuff, which
Yeah.
kind of leads me to something else that I've kind of come to believe. This is just out of the phases I've been through, but I get really I laugh a lot at the things that Christians are afraid of.
Hmm.
Like, you think that these things are going to, for all intents and purposes, intimidate the gospel? Like,
Hmm.
no way, dude. Like, just get in there and be real with people. And it's getting late, so I'm a little tired, so I can't think of a perfect example. But like, just some of these cultural things, music was one that we talked about earlier. We fortunately didn't have that quite a big experience with being anti band, some bands or whatever. But um, just some of these things where we're not trained to walk through it with people. We're trained to avoid it and meet them at whatever point they come out at and be like, hey, wasn't that terrible? It brought you away from God. Like, no way. Like, just, get in there, maybe it's like a TV show or something I might have found offensive in the past. But now it's like, okay, I can understand the art form of it. I can understand the storytelling of it. I'm not going to watch anything, but like, yeah, I just get really amused by the way that people get offended by some of the stuff they think intimidates or waters down the gospel. It's as if it's not strong enough to stand on
Hmm.
its own.
I like that word too, intimidate. Like the idea of intimidating the gospel, and you talked about the idea of like we need to instruct the culture instead of like impact the culture. Like you use that word too, and like that makes sense if you're worried about the culture intimidating the gospel or intimidating people's faith. Well, yeah, then that's when you need to instruct. You have to take this we're going to teach you the right way approach of doing life. Yeah, that's a real I really like that word, the idea of intimidating the gospel. That's really interesting.
Well, it's all over the place. So,
Yeah, oh, totally, totally. I'm pretty sure that's why I wasn't allowed to watch the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air as a as a teenager. I'm positive.
Other things you can throw on our Twitter feed, things you weren't allowed to do.
Yeah, things you weren't allowed to watch.
Did I tell you my Guns N' Roses story?
No.
No, this is a lot. I mean, this was before I even moved back, but before my again, here's a delineation I'm making. Like
Yeah.
before I was a Christian, I was going to Lutheran churches. So it's like
Sure.
that was something that I was taught. I wasn't a Christian yet.
Sure.
Which again, if that's your story, it's not necessarily wrong. I'm just saying something to be maybe a little bit careful of when interpreting it for somebody else. Um, But anyway, so my parents did have kind of these standards and things, and there were some things we weren't allowed to watch, but we did live overseas. So I had like MTV Europe.
Hmm.
It was before the internet. I really wanted Guns N' Roses Use Your Illusion 1 and 2
Okay.
for my birthday, I think. Terminator 2 had come out. We had gotten movies like 6 months after the US got them, so it like came over there, and it was a huge deal. And I really wanted that album. Well, I ended up getting. I did not get that album because my parents read the lyrics from somebody else's album. They're like, nope, not good. Which, to be fair, Guns N' Roses lyrics are pretty bad. There is a ton of misogyny in 80s rock that we should have been careful of. So
Right.
they did the right thing. But I just like telling the story for the juxtaposition because I ended up getting the Mr. Big album.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Remember Mr. Big?
I remember it.
You shouldn't because it was pretty bad.
Yeah. No, it's not something I hung on to.
Right. That was a little bit of that, like, got to keep it away from him. And look, I do the same thing for my kid. My kid is, because of what he listens to on his games and stuff, he's getting into hip hop. He's listening to some artists that I certainly would never listen to because I just don't like the music, but also because I'm a little afraid that lyrically, I don't mind the F word. I don't mind the swearing. It's the message. It's particularly
Sure.
how do you treat women and
Yeah.
how do you treat other people that might be beneath you. So it's like training instead of. But here's the thing. Again, kind of going back to our original conversation. Instead of talking through it and instructing me as a kid through it and saying this is why it may be bad, and maybe even sitting down and listening to it with me, that kind of stuff, which I'll be honest, I've yet to do with my kids' hip hop preferences. But like, instead of doing that, it's like, nope, we're going to remove you completely.
Yeah.
And then, hey, that'll fix it. No, that just makes you want it more.
Yeah.
There was this inability to walk through some of the stuff we saw as sinful or intimidating because we just thought it would blow our faith apart.
Yeah. To point to another juxtaposition, I'm just going to try and use smart words that you say.
Close.
Close, like it's a good attempt, or I almost got the word right. We're
Missed
both
the syllable, but just keep going. Juxtaposition.
Yeah, I don't know. You're the one on the NyQuil. I don't know if we should trust you.
5 minutes ago.
So props to my dad for. So I do think in youth group, I don't remember ever getting, like, Christian music was pushed, but I don't ever think we got the secular music is bad argument. Maybe we did. I don't remember getting it, and I could just be forgetting it. I just think we were just genuinely excited about Christian music. But I still remember the first CD I ever bought was Green Day's Dookie.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents were not happy about it.
Mm-hmm.
They did not think the lyrics were appropriate. And they didn't take it away from me, though. I don't remember them ever taking it away from me and saying, you can't listen to this. I could be misremembering this, but it did lead to a conversation about masturbation with my dad. So my dad did walk me through what they were talking about and why it may not be helpful, and didn't just take it away from me, because he's like, you know what they're talking about here. And I was like, I think so. And then we had a conversation about it. So props to my dad for doing it the hard way. So
God bless you, Mike Sarla. Let's get him on here to talk about that conversation.
It'd be interesting to ask him if he remembers that the same way. I probably was pissed. So I probably was not happy to be talking about it. So yeah, it'd be we should not have my parents on. Let's not do that.
I'll talk to him without you here. We'll do it that
You,
way.
you,
That's
you have to help them figure out the technology. I got to do what on a computer now?
no. I look. That's a pretty appropriate way to do it. I just think that there's quite a temptation to think everyone is safe if you just remove it, and
Yeah.
you're really not speaking to the heart piece of it all.
My guess is most parents didn't do that.
Right.
Didn't sit with it and
It also devalues the fact, and this we're going pretty long here, but we'll certainly have an episode about music and stuff because that's definitely something that you're very much into.
check out my other podcast.
Yeah, plug it right now. Um, it devalues the fact that like music's an art form, right?
Hmm.
Like Green Day Dookie, that's a really good album.
Yeah.
It still holds up. It is really good. It's really fun. I'll still listen to it from time to time and be like, man. And maybe everyone's sentimental about the music of their youth, but like some of that stuff is still really good.
Yeah.
And when you separate because you want to avoid, because you want to have no hint of sin anywhere, you remove the fact that God created people to create this art, to create this experience for each other. And yeah, maybe it doesn't show up the way that you want it to show up. But then, of course, we got to do it our own way. So we have to have Christian music, which, look, for all intents and purposes, most of it was garbage. Some of it was good. And, but you had to kind of dig to find the good stuff, kind of like you have
Yeah.
to do in real music. But like, yeah, people wouldn't take Christian music seriously because they knew it was just the knockoff.
Yeah.
That'll be a different conversation for that episode. But maybe that's kind of what I'm going back to after this whole conversation is like, because we are so afraid of all of these things, we were never taught how to walk through it with people. Because if we were walking through, if we were too close to whatever was sinful, whatever is too tempting, it was going to stain us in some way. And God forbid we fall into it at all.
Yeah.
Then we're just like, then God's, then it's cheap grace. So let's guilt you about, cheap grace that way.
Hmm.
Like, instead of just leaving, instead of teaching us like, hey, go alongside this person, go with it, help them out through these things. Um, it's like, you got to be completely removed. Now, there may be some people in the audience being like, oh, he's advocating for someone to be okay doing drugs. Like, no, I'm not advocating that. Don't be silly, right? What I'm advocating is like, just don't be afraid of what's in culture and what God has formed through people there, and try and find him in those places rather than avoiding it. Because you avoid it, first of all, you're going to miss a bunch of really beautiful stuff, but you're also just it's going to become more tempting anyway.
Yeah. I think too, like there may be times where you have to just remove something from a kid. I still think you're not teaching them a better way. And I get it. Like if you have a kid who's doing something that could be really dangerous, yeah,
Of
you
course.
remove them from the situation. You remove it from their life. But yeah, there's an opportunity there to let your kids. I homeschool my kids. I don't. My wife does. And so obviously we've pulled way back and hidden our kids. I mean, they are hidden from a lot of things. And so like we try and like get out there and we try and have them watch a bunch of different news shows so that they can just try and go through it. And like I don't agree with everything being said on a lot of it. Like I'm like, I don't know, I'm kind of question about that. But like we just wanted them to like be able to like, okay, you got to figure out what you got to start deciphering what is good about this or what is bad about this. And when I listen to stuff in the car, like I'll listen to NPR mostly I mostly listen to music, but if I'm listening to the radio, I listen to NPR and like I try really hard to point out things I think here's why somebody would disagree with it. Here's
Yep.
why somebody I understand what they're saying here, but I can see why that would really bug people or, and just trying to push those buttons. And that's a harder thing to do. It's easier just to leave on Fox News or leave on NPR and just say, nope, this is the only source.
Yeah.
So,
That's another episode.
yeah, I do own Dookie on vinyl. Just so we're clear.
You sinner.
Well, it's a lot harder to find Christian music on vinyl, to be honest. Most of my vinyl is not Christian. Although My two greatest finds are I have two Steve Taylor albums from the early 80s on vinyl. Still two of my favorites.
Burn set on vinyl too.
That's what got me into this stupid, bad, expensive habit was I had avoided vinyl because well, this is a whole other I had avoided vinyl because of the cost.
You're an addict.
I am.
I'm going to walk through this with you and see you through the other side. I'll come over and listen.
The potential not having a contract that in January, that cured me of any desire to buy vinyl. I'm just saving all of my money.
Yeah.
So,
well, hey, this has been fun. We went kind of long, but that's probably going to be par for the course. Hopefully you stayed with us. Even if you didn't, we thank you for listening. And we'll try and get someone on here for next time.
Yeah. Well, I'll do this every week. This is great. Just an excuse to sit around and talk about stuff. Next week, Batman.
We're old. All right. Thanks, Caleb.
All right. Talk to you soon. Thanks again for joining us for this episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. Let us know what you thought about this episode or any of our other shows. You can find us on Twitter at the handle @SurvivedYG. You can also email us at ISurviveYouthGroup@gmail.com. If you're interested in being on the show, let us know. You didn't necessarily have to attend our youth group, but we eventually would like to expand this out to get to hear more experiences from other 90s youth group kids or even some 2000s. Again, if you are interested in being on the show, let us know. Hit us up at that email and we'll try and connect. Please subscribe and share the podcast if you're so inclined. Leave a rating or review. If you enjoy this show, you might also enjoy the other podcast I do. It's a musical podcast called the Album Anniversary Podcast. Over the last couple of years, I've researched and documented the release date of thousands of albums. Throughout the week, I post about them on social media. We've had a couple different formats on the show, but it's a chance to sit down and talk about some of the music I've documented on my calendar. Once again, that is the Album Anniversary Podcast. The music at the beginning and the end of this show is the instrumental version of the song Positive Charge by the artist Dread Pirate Roberts. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.